Title: The Dual-Track Architect, a functional blueprint for asymmetric political warfare, disrupting the legacy network. Preambles. In the arena of modern political contest, the old rules of symmetric engagement no longer suffice. Traditional campaigns, built on public rallies, policy platforms, television advertisements, and direct voter persuasion, operate within a visible, rule-bound grid that legacy institutions have long mastered. These institutions, comprising interlocking networks of non-elected power nodes, entrenched bureaucratic layers, aligned media ecosystems, donor classes, academic credentialing systems, and social clubs, function less as neutral arbiters of democratic will and more as self-perpetuating gatekeepers. They shape narratives, allocate resources, enforce norms, and marginalize challengers not through open debate alone, but through coordinated friction, selective enforcement, and cultural hegemony. This book treats the contemporary political campaign not as a civic exercise in persuasion, but as a deliberate disruption of a legacy network. It draws from the timeless logic of strategy articulated by Sun Tzu in The Art of War. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. The weak do not confront the strong head-on. They exploit asymmetries, attack vulnerabilities, shape the environment, and win without decisive kinetic battles. In politics, this translates to mapping institutional interconnectivity, generating controlled friction, poisoning data streams, engineering narratives, and maintaining ironclad deniability, while the public face of the effort remains one of idealistic reform. The dual-track architect model at the heart of this manual addresses a fundamental paradox of high-stakes political disruption: the need for moral authority and broad public appeal on one hand, and the ruthless operational realism required to dismantle entrenched advantages on the other. The A-team consists of high-optical public servants, idealists, communicators, and grassroots mobilizers, whose role is to project authenticity, policy vision, and class-strata heroism, an outsider challenging the system from within its own language of fairness and renewal. The B-team comprises technical specialists, pattern analysts, intelligence gatherers, and disruption operatives who operate in shadows, insulated from the optics-driven constraints that would otherwise neuter effectiveness. The firewall between these tracks is absolute. Structural segregation, cutouts, compartmentalization, and psychological discipline ensure that the right hand never knows what the left is doing. As the author's note in the operational manual emphasizes, the moment the A-team suspects the B-team's existence, the moral authority of the movement collapses. Strategy here is the art of managed schizophrenia at organizational scale. Two teams, one body, unified only at the level of the mastermind who maintains detachment. This is not cynicism. It is recognition that power contests in mature systems reward those who understand the terrain as it actually exists, layered, networked, resistant to frontal assault, rather than as idealistic theory pretends it to be. The nature of the legacy network. Legacy networks are not conspiracy in the cartoon sense but emergent structures of aligned incentives, shared class markers, revolving doors, and mutual reinforcement. Non-elected power nodes, senior civil servants with de facto permanence, regulatory agency staff, foundation executives, university administrators, think tank researchers, media gatekeepers, corporate compliance officers, and elite social circles, often wield more durable influence than transient elected officials. Mapping these requires elite network analysis, tracing institutional interconnectivity through schools, Ivy League pipelines, and equivalent regional feeders, boards, non-profit, corporate, advisory, social clubs, donor lists, alumni networks, and event attendance patterns. These nodes do not require daily coordination to function as a grid. Shared worldview, career incentives, risk aversion, and reputational economies create emergent alignment. Load-bearing donors fund parallel infrastructure that sustains opposition operations across election cycles. Moral and financial fault lines, hypocrisies, conflicts of interest, funding dependencies, personal vulnerabilities, represent exploitable pressure points. Pattern-of-life analysis of inner circles reveals routines, associations, and predictable responses that can be leveraged for passive intelligence or active measures. In asymmetric political warfare, the goal is rarely total annihilation of the opponent in a single cycle. It is to impose disproportionate costs, erode legitimacy, trigger internal fractures, and create windows for structural breakthrough. Superior conventional resources, media dominance, regulatory capture, donor depth, invite indirect approaches, weaponizing the opponent's own bureaucracy against itself, turning transparency rules and ethics processes into sources of friction, generating spontaneous administrative obstacles through the swarm method, or corrupting internal metrics via data poisoning. These tactics echo historical asymmetric strategies, where weaker actors avoided strength and struck at weaknesses, whether Scythian mobility against Persian mass, Vietnamese protracted war against American firepower, or Maoist emphasis on political warfare and base building. Political warfare itself is an established domain, distinct from but complementary to kinetic conflict. As George F. Kennan articulated in the early Cold War context, it encompasses both overt and covert measures, propaganda, economic tools, support for aligned elements, psychological operations, to achieve objectives without large-scale military engagement. Modern variants include narrative delegitimization, controlled leaks calibrated for maximum dispersion while preserving deniability, and bypassing gatekeepers through direct-to-voter pipelines enabled by digital fragmentation. Weaponizing silence turns media bias into the story itself. When legacy outlets predictably overreach or ignore, their selectivity becomes self-indictment. Optical purity for the candidate, positioning as the authentic disruptor untainted by the very networks being challenged, amplifies this dynamic. Why compartmentalization and deniability are non-negotiable. Phase I of the blueprint, the infrastructure of deniability, establishes the foundational tradecraft. Structural segregation isolates idealists from realists not out of distrust of the former's character, but recognition of their operational environment. Public-facing actors must navigate scrutiny from opposition researchers, media, regulators, and their own base. Any whiff of dirty tricks contaminates the brand irreversibly. The B team, by contrast, requires freedom to engage technical surveillance countermeasures, TSCM, passive OSINT on public data silos, defensive SIGINT to spoof digital signatures, and more aggressive friction tactics. The cutout, a carefully selected and trained liaison officer, serves as the sole bridge, minimizing direct exposure. Communication security shifts from easily subpoenaed digital footprints, emails, messaging apps, cloud storage, to analog dead drops, couriers, or highly disciplined protocols. Financial ghosting routes costs through layered tertiary shell entities, adhering to the letter of campaign finance law while achieving operational separation. These measures are not exotic espionage relics. They are prudent adaptations to an era where commercial data brokers, persistent digital trails, and politicized enforcement multiply risks. Historical intelligence tradecraft, compartmentation, need to know, burn switches, transfers directly because political warfare shares DNA with influence operations and counter-influence. Personnel architecture demands rigorous vetting, loyalty variables, psychological resilience, points of failure. A team profiles prioritize high optical qualities, charisma, ideological consistency, media fluency, while B team profiles emphasize technical proficiency, pattern recognition, discretion, and tolerance for moral gray zones inherent in disruption. The primary candidate requires their own compartmentalization, shielded from operational details that could compromise authenticity or invite legal entanglement, yet informed enough at strategic level to maintain alignment. Psychological compartmentalization is the human firewall. Idealists must believe the campaign operates within ethical bounds of democratic norms. Realists must accept that legacy networks rarely yield to persuasion alone when core interests are threatened. The mastermind's detachment is paramount. Ego. Mission creep or emotional investment in either track erodes the model. History is littered with operations that collapsed when compartmentation failed. Defections, leaks, pattern recognition by adversaries, or internal suspicion breeding paranoia. The institutional grid and active disruption. Phase II maps the battlefield with precision. Elite network analysis identifies load-bearing elements rather than chasing every headline. Vulnerability assessment targets fault lines, financial dependencies that can be stressed, moral inconsistencies that erode public trust when highlighted, institutional inertia that can be amplified. Signals and surveillance emphasize defense first, TSCM for campaign headquarters, passive gathering to avoid offensive overreach that invites blowback, while understanding the opposition's pattern of life informs timing and targeting. Phase III shifts to active sabotage and disruption, always calibrated for asymmetry and deniability. Institutional friction tactics weaponize existing rules. Ethics filings, audits, bureaucratic processes turned into delays and resource sinks, paper cuts accumulating into paralysis. The swarm method orchestrates seemingly independent administrative obstacles, FOIA requests, complaints from varied actors, regulatory inquiries, that overwhelm capacity without central direction. Data poisoning corrupts internal polling or analytics, inducing misallocation of opponent resources. Social engineering at low levels, staff infiltration, yields insights without high-level compromise. Narrative delegitimization operates on multiple vectors. Controlled leak cycles disperse damaging information through indirect channels, creating plausible distance. Direct-to-voter pipelines, email lists, alternative platforms, grassroots networks, bypass legacy gatekeepers whose trust has eroded. Making media bias the lead story exploits the asymmetry of open societies. Legacy outlets bound by commercial and ideological incentives struggle against decentralized dissemination. The candidate's class strata, status, signaling betrayal of elite consensus in service of broader public interest, serves as both shield and spear, framing attacks as establishment panic. These methods echo lawfare in its various forms, using legal and administrative processes offensively to constrain or impose costs, while defensively shielding one's own operations. Bureaucratic inertia, often lamented as inefficiency, becomes a feature to be exploited when turned outward. Yet practitioners must recognize limits. Over-reliance on disruption without parallel institution building or superior positive vision risks mutual degradation of norms, where both sides adopt mirror tactics and public trust in the system itself collapses. Contingency, collapse, and the ethics of execution. Phase IV prepares for failure modes inherent to high-risk operations. The burn switch identifies compromised assets for isolation. Rogue element, defenses prefabricate disavowal narratives. Evidence sanitization, physical and digital, scrubs trails while preserving operational learning. Post-election transition plans address reintegration or permanent dissolution of teams, recognizing that wartime structures rarely suit peacetime governance. The efficacy of the entire manual hinges on discipline. Asymmetric approaches have succeeded historically when the weaker or challenger side maintained cohesion, exploited terrain, here, institutional and informational, and sustained will longer than the incumbent. They have failed when discipline eroded, deniability collapsed, or disruption substituted for vision. In democratic contexts, the additional constraint is legitimacy. Sustained advantage ultimately requires delivering measurable breaks from legacy dysfunction, tangible improvements in governance, economic mobility, cultural confidence, rather than perpetual sabotage cycles that erode the republic's operating system. This is not a call to lawlessness. It is a functional recognition that politics in networked, high-trust societies with powerful permanent institutions demands sophisticated strategy. Idealistic campaigns that ignore the grid are routinely neutralized. Purely cynical ones lack the broad consent needed for durable change. The dual-track model attempts synthesis, optics and idealism for mobilization and legitimacy, realism and tradecraft for competitive parity. Readers approaching this text, whether strategists refining doctrine, analysts studying power dynamics, or citizens seeking to understand hidden mechanics of contests, must confront uncomfortable realities. Elite networks exist and shape outcomes. Asymmetries of resources invite indirect strategies. Compartmentalization is a double-edged tool, powerful when executed with monastic discipline, catastrophic when breached. Digital persistence and commercial surveillance have raised the bar for operational security beyond casual efforts. Implementation demands talent of the highest order, individuals capable of moral and operational schizophrenia without fracture. It requires resources routed with precision. Most critically, it requires a mastermind who treats the enterprise as architecture, not personal vendetta, detached enough to dissolve components when the mission evolves or costs outweigh gains. The legacy network did not emerge overnight, nor will it dissolve through one campaign. Disruption creates openings, consolidation and institution building secure them. This blueprint provides the operational manual for the disruption phase. Subsequent volumes or companion works may address parallel structures, narrative dominance, or governance post-breakthrough. For now, the focus is functional. How a determined challenger, facing superior entrenched coordination, can impose asymmetry, maintain deniability, protect optical purity, and advance through the grid without self-immolation. Sun Tzu warned that knowing the enemy and knowing oneself ensures victory in 100 battles. This manual operationalizes that wisdom for the political domain. It assumes the legacy network is real, resilient, and adaptive. It assumes challengers enter with disadvantages in funding, institutional capture, and narrative infrastructure. It offers no guarantees, only a structured path that has analogues in successful insurgencies, influence operations, and historical power shifts, where indirect approaches compounded into decisive advantage. The mastermind's detachment is not amorality. It is the prerequisite for coherent execution in environments where moral signaling is itself a weaponized currency. Idealists provide the soul and the story, realists provide the leverage. Together, under strict separation, they form the dual-track architect, capable of disrupting what frontal assault cannot. This is the functional blueprint. Study it as doctrine, critique it as theory, or adapt it as needed. The terrain of power waits for those who map it accurately rather than wish it away. Preamble to Phase I, the infrastructure of deniability. The foundation of any effective asymmetric political operation lies not in bold public gestures or viral messaging, but in the quiet architecture of separation and protection. Phase I establishes the infrastructure of deniability, the invisible scaffolding that allows a campaign to project moral clarity and idealistic reform through its public face, while enabling the operational realism necessary to navigate and disrupt entrenched legacy networks. Without this infrastructure, even the most sophisticated mapping of elite nodes or narrative strategies collapses under the weight of exposure, leaks, legal scrutiny, or internal contamination. In modern political contests, legacy networks, interlocking webs of non-elected bureaucrats, aligned donors, media ecosystems, academic and non-profit institutions, and social circles, possess structural advantages in resources, institutional memory, and narrative control. A challenger cannot afford symmetric engagement, where every action occurs in the open under rules the incumbent class has helped codify. Instead, success demands deliberate asymmetry, maintaining optical purity for the A-team of high-visibility idealists and public servants, while insulating the B-team of technical specialists and pattern analysts who execute harder-edged functions. This duality is not deception for its own sake. It reflects the reality that power in mature democracies often resides outside formal electoral arenas. Public-facing actors must inspire voters, withstand media examination, and embody the class-traitor archetype, an authentic outsider challenging elite consensus without being tainted by the very mechanics of contest. Any suspicion that the idealistic core coordinates with shadow disruption erodes the moral authority essential for broad mobilization. Voters and activists tolerate imperfection in leaders. They rarely forgive perceived hypocrisy at the organizational level. The dual-track architect model therefore mandates absolute structural segregation. The A-team operates in the sunlight of policy papers, town halls, digital outreach, and volunteer coordination. Its members are selected for charisma, ideological consistency, media fluency, and the ability to project sincerity. They must genuinely believe the campaign adheres to the highest ethical standards of democratic competition. This belief is not cynicism imposed from above but a necessary firewall that preserves authenticity. If the A-team senses parallel tracks, cognitive dissonance sets in, leaks become more likely, and the entire heroic disruption narrative fractures. The B-team, by contrast, inhabits a compartmented world of intelligence gathering, vulnerability assessment, friction generation, and contingency planning. Its members require technical proficiency in data analysis, pattern recognition, operational security, and tolerance for grey zone activities that legacy networks themselves employ through proxies, lawfare, and institutional inertia. Yet these realists must remain invisible to the public brand. Their work supports rather than defines the candidate's image. Bridging these tracks without contamination requires tradecraft adapted from intelligence operations to the political domain. The cutout, a trusted liaison officer, serves as the sole authorized channel. This individual knows enough to transmit guidance and feedback, but remains ignorant of full operational details on either side, embodying classic compartmentation. Historical espionage doctrine emphasizes cutouts precisely because a compromised intermediary reveals only limited connections, protecting the principles. In politics, the same logic applies. Opposition researchers, regulators, or hostile media probing for coordination encounter only the cutout, whose role can be framed as routine liaison if exposed. Communication security forms another pillar. In an era of ubiquitous digital surveillance, commercial data brokers, metadata retention, subpoenas, and advanced persistent threats from state or private actors, reliance on email, messaging apps, or cloud platforms creates persistent footprints. Transitioning critical operational dialogue to analog methods, physical dead drops, in-person meetings under pretexts, or couriers using disciplined protocols, reduces traceability. While analog systems sacrifice speed and bandwidth, they excel in deniability. A handwritten note passed via cutout leaves no server logs, no recoverable metadata, and no forensic digital trail easily subpoenaed. Modern campaigns that ignore this reality risk rapid compromise. Even secure apps have been breached or compelled to produce records. The infrastructure of deniability, therefore, treats digital tools as tactical conveniences for low-sensitivity matters only, reserving high-value coordination for analog resilience. Financial ghosting completes the foundational triad. Operational costs, whether for specialized analysis, countermeasures, or discrete support activities, must be routed through layered tertiary entities to avoid direct linkage to the campaign or candidate. Campaign finance laws impose disclosure requirements, contribution limits, and prohibitions on certain sources, yet legacy networks routinely leverage dark money pathways, 501c, for social welfare organizations, trade associations, and opaque structures to influence outcomes while obscuring origins. Challengers adopting similar separation must navigate these rules with precision. Shells and intermediaries can provide legal distance, but sloppy execution invites Federal Election Commission scrutiny, civil suits, or criminal exposure for false statements or conspiracy. The goal is routing that complies on paper while achieving operational insulation, a delicate balance requiring expert legal navigation and disciplined execution. Personnel architecture underpins all else. Recruiting, profiling, and vetting for both tracks demands rigor beyond standard campaign hiring. A team members need high optical qualities, the ability to embody the movement's ideals without deviation that could be weaponized. B-team profiles prioritize discretion, analytical sharpness, loyalty variables assessment, and psychological resilience. Vetting identifies not only skills, but points of failure, financial pressures, ideological inconsistencies, family vulnerabilities, or history of indiscretion. Psychological compartmentalization training for the primary candidate and key figures ensures they can maintain strategic awareness without operational contamination that might compromise authenticity or invite legal jeopardy. The master's detachment remains the linchpin. The architect of the dual-track model must resist the gravitational pull of ego, tactical excitement, or emotional investment in either team. Over-identification with the A-team's idealism risks naive exposure. Over-identification with B-team realism risks cynicism that leaks into public tone. Detachment enables ruthless evaluation, when to reinforce firewalls, when to activate contingencies, and when to dissolve compromised elements. History demonstrates that operations fail less from external opposition than from internal erosion of compartmentation. Soviet illegals, Cold War cutouts, and modern influence campaigns succeeded or collapsed based on discipline in separation. In asymmetric political warfare, deniability infrastructure is defensive and offensive simultaneously. It shields the campaign from mirrored tactics. Legacy networks excel at selective enforcement, leaks to aligned media, and bureaucratic harassment. It also enables calibrated disruption without self-inflicted wounds. A campaign hemorrhaging internal suspicions or digital trails cannot map institutional grids effectively, let alone execute narrative delegitimization or contingency plans. This phase I preamble establishes why infrastructure precedes all action. Mapping elite networks, phase II, without deniability invites countermapping and preemptive strikes. Active sabotage, phase III, without firewalls produces blowback that destroys optical purity. Contingency measures, phase IV, become irrelevant if foundational separation never existed. The dual-track architect recognizes that legacy networks did not build their advantages through transparency alone. Challengers must match sophistication in protection while surpassing in adaptability and will. Implementation demands monastic discipline. Talent must be sourced, tested, and bound by shared understanding of the mission's dual nature without explicit revelation to all. Resources must flow through sanitized channels. Communication protocols must be drilled until they become reflexive. Most critically, the human element, the psychological capacity for managed separation, must be cultivated. Idealists provide the soul and mobilizing energy. Realists provide leverage against resilient structures. United only at the mastermind level, they form a coherent whole greater than the sum of visible parts. Failure to build this infrastructure transforms a potential disruption campaign into a conventional effort vulnerable to the very asymmetries it seeks to exploit. With it, the campaign gains resilience, optionality, and the capacity to impose costs disproportionately while preserving the candidate's heroic status as a genuine reformer. The pages that follow detail the protocols, profiles, processes, and psychological disciplines required. Study them not as theoretical constructs but as operational doctrine. The legacy network adapts, so must any challenger serious about breaching its grid. 1. The firewall protocol. The firewall protocol operationalizes structural segregation between the A team and B team. Segregation is physical, informational, social, and financial. Physical separation might involve distinct headquarters locations or staggered schedules that minimize overlap. Informational firewalls enforce strict need-to-know. A team receives only sanitized strategic guidance. B team receives operational objectives, framed without revealing full public brand constraints. Social mixing is discouraged through policy and culture. Joint events limited to large, deniable settings where conversation stays superficial. 1.1 Structural segregation, isolating the A-team idealists from the B-team realists. Structural segregation begins at recruitment and extends through daily operations. The A-team occupies visible campaign roles, policy development, volunteer coordination, public events, digital content creation, and donor outreach within legal bounds. These individuals are encouraged to view the campaign as a pure expression of democratic idealism. Their training emphasizes narrative consistency, voter empathy, and resilience against attacks framed as establishment pushback. The B team focuses on analytical, technical, and preparatory functions, network mapping support, vulnerability identification, defensive countermeasures, and contingency scripting. Physical offices or workspaces should be separate, ideally in different buildings or cities if resources allow. Communication occurs exclusively through the liaison officer cutout. Shared digital platforms are prohibited for sensitive matters. Even innocuous overlap, shared vendors or events, requires vetting to prevent pattern recognition by opposition. Example: in a mid-sized statewide campaign, the A team might operate from a bustling downtown headquarters filled with volunteers and press briefings. The B team could function from a nondescript suburban office or remote locations, with staff using cover identities tied to consulting or research entities. Joint leadership meetings never occur. Instead, the mastermind or cutout synthesizes inputs. This mirrors intelligence cell structures, where operational teams remain ignorant of collection teams' sources and methods. Risks include mission creep, where ambitious A-team members seek more effective tactics, or B-team frustration with perceived naivety. Mitigation involves clear role charters, regular mastermind reinforcement of boundaries, and psychological support tailored to each track. 1.2 The cutout, selecting and training the liaison officer. The liaison officer cutout is the critical human bridge. Selection criteria include proven discretion, neutral demeanor, technical competence for secure transmission, ideological alignment without fanaticism, and personal circumstances that reduce compromise risk, stable finances, family, no public profile. Ideal candidates might come from legal, military liaison, or executive assistant backgrounds with prior exposure to sensitive environments but no overt political footprint. Training emphasizes tradecraft basics, memory techniques for verbal transmission to avoid written records, recognition of surveillance indicators, emergency protocols, e.g., burn signals, and strict compartmentalization. The cutout knows Team A objectives and Team B capabilities in general terms, but never full operational details or identities beyond necessary contacts. Transmission occurs via scheduled dead drops, pre-arranged secure meets, or one-time pads for written summaries when needed. Historical parallel: espionage cutouts in Cold War networks isolated handlers from assets, limiting damage from any single compromise. In politics, the cutout can be framed publicly as a senior advisor or logistics coordinator if partially exposed, preserving deniability. 1.3 Communication security: transitioning from digital footprints to analog dead drops. Digital communications generate metadata, recoverable content, and forensic artifacts. Even encrypted apps face provide a compulsion or sophisticated hacking. The protocol mandates tiered communication. Low sensitivity, routine scheduling, public logistics, approved encrypted apps with auto-delete and minimal retention. Medium sensitivity, strategic alignment, voice or in-person via cutout. High sensitivity, operational directives, vulnerabilities, contingencies. Analog-only physical dead drops in public but low-traffic locations. Specific park benches, library books, vehicle drops, couriers following surveillance detection routes, or one-time verbal briefings in swept locations. Dead drop execution requires discipline, pre-arranged signals, chalk marks, tape placements, timing windows, and fallback protocols. Training includes dry runs and counter-surveillance walks. While slower than digital, analog reduces subpoena risk and pattern analysis by data brokers. Example: a B-team analyst identifies a donor vulnerability. Instead of emailing, the finding is summarized in a coded handwritten note placed in a dead drop. The cutout retrieves it during a routine errand, memorizes or transcribes essentials, and conveys sanitized guidance to A-team leadership as research insight without source details. This maintains separation while enabling informed decisions. 1.4 Financial ghosting: routing operational costs through tertiary shell entities. Financial transparency requirements make direct funding of B-team activities from campaign accounts risky. Ghosting involves layering. Primary campaign funds legitimate A-team activities. Separate legal entities, LLCs, consulting firms, or aligned nonprofits, handle B-team costs. Tertiary shells, entities created with minimal public footprint, receive funds from further removed sources and invoice for research, advisory, or data services that can be documented as arm's-length transactions. Compliance demands meticulous record-keeping that satisfies audits while achieving separation. Legal counsel must review structures to avoid prohibited coordination or false reporting. Risks include discovery via bank records, whistleblowers, or forensic accounting, as seen in various dark money investigations where shell companies obscured donor intent. Example: a B-team TSCM sweep and pattern analysis contract routes through a Delaware LLC owned by another entity, invoiced as generic strategic consulting. Funds originate from a compliant donor-advised structure or aligned 501(c)(4) without direct campaign linkage. Documentation exists for legitimacy, but the operational purpose remains firewalled. This completes the firewall protocol. Rigorous adherence creates the protected space necessary for subsequent phases. 2. Personnel architecture. Personnel decisions determine operational viability more than any tactic. Architecture encompasses profiling, recruitment, vetting, and ongoing management tailored to track specific demands. 2.1 The A-team profile: recruiting high optical public servants. A team recruits exhibit charisma, policy depth, communication skills, and authentic alignment with the disruptive narrative. They should project sincerity. Voters detect scripted idealism. Backgrounds often include local office experience, business success outside elite circles, or activism demonstrating class strata credentials, e.g., professionals critiquing their own industry's capture. Vetting emphasizes public record consistency and absence of compromising associations. Recruitment channels: grassroots networks, aligned professional associations, and targeted outreach to disillusioned insiders. Onboarding stresses brand discipline and boundary awareness without revealing dual tracks. 2.2 The B-team profile: recruiting technical specialists and pattern analysts. B-team members require analytical rigor, operational security mindset, pattern recognition aptitude, and comfort with ambiguity. Profiles include former intelligence analysts, data scientists, private investigators, cybersecurity experts, or researchers with experience in network mapping or open source intelligence, OSINT. Discretion and low public profiles are essential. Ideological zeal is secondary to competence and loyalty to mission parameters. Recruitment is discreet, often through trusted referrals or neutral professional networks, framed as special projects consulting. 2.3 The vetting process, identifying loyalty variables and points of failure. Vetting combines standard background checks, criminal, financial, employment with deeper assessment, social media deep dives, reference interviews probing consistency, polygraph or structured integrity interviews where legal, and scenario-based testing for discretion. Loyalty variables include financial stresses, family obligations, past ideological shifts, or susceptibility to flattery blackmail. Points of failure might be gambling debts, extramarital affairs, or history of substance issues that could be leveraged. Ongoing monitoring, with legal safeguards, includes periodic revetting and behavioral indicators. Example, a candidate with strong skills but recent financial reversals might be deemed higher risk for B-team due to potential monetization of access. 2.4 Psychological compartmentalization for the primary candidate. The primary candidate requires tailored compartmentalization. They receive high-level strategic briefings on threats and opportunities, but minimal operational granularity that could create legal exposure or force inauthentic public statements. Training involves mental exercises for maintaining focus on public role while trusting the broader architecture. Support mechanisms, confidential advisors or stress management, help manage the isolation of partial knowledge. This prevents the candidate from inadvertently signaling knowledge of B-team activities during media scrutiny or debates. Historical political figures have maintained plausible separation through disciplined staff structures. The dual track elevates this to doctrinal necessity. Phase I as a whole creates the protected operational space. Its protocols, when executed with precision, transform vulnerability into strategic depth. Legacy networks rely on exposure and enforcement asymmetries. The infrastructure of deniability neutralizes those advantages, enabling the mapping, disruption, and contingency phases that follow. Discipline here is non-negotiable. Shortcuts invite the very collapse the manual seeks to prevent. Preamble to Phase II, mapping the institutional grid. Phase II, mapping the institutional grid, shifts the dual-track architect from defensive foundations to offensive intelligence preparation. With the infrastructure of deniability firmly established in Phase I, structural segregation, cutouts, analog communications, financial ghosting, rigorous personnel architecture, and psychological compartmentalization, the campaign gains the protected operational space required to conduct sophisticated reconnaissance without contaminating the A-team's optical purity or exposing the B-team's realist functions. This phase treats the political battlefield not as a simple contest between candidates or parties, but as a dense, resilient institutional grid dominated by non-elected power nodes. Legacy networks derive enduring strength from these nodes. Senior civil servants with institutional memory and regulatory discretion, foundation executives directing philanthropic flows, university administrators shaping credentialing and cultural narratives, think tank researchers framing policy debates, media gatekeepers curating public discourse, corporate compliance and ESG officers influencing capital allocation, and elite social clubs fostering informal coordination. These elements interconnect through shared educational pipelines, Ivy League and regional equivalents, overlapping board memberships, donor networks, alumni associations, conference circuits, and revolving door career paths. The grid operates through emergent alignment rather than constant conspiracy. Shared class markers, professional incentives, reputational economies, and worldview congruence produce coordinated effects without centralized command. Load-bearing donors sustain parallel infrastructure, dark money vehicles, 501c, for organizations, aligned nonprofits, and super PACs that amplify opposition capabilities across cycles. Mapping this grid reveals leverage points. Financial dependencies vulnerable to stress, moral or ideological fault lines exploitable through narrative contrast, bureaucratic inertia that can be amplified into paralysis, and personal or institutional patterns of life that inform timing and targeting. Elite network analysis, drawn from social network analysis, SNA methodologies, provides the analytical backbone. Techniques include identifying central nodes, high-degree actors with disproportionate connectivity, brokers, those bridging clusters, and dense cliques, tightly interconnected subgroups. In political contexts, donor networks predict candidate success by revealing resource flows. Policy networks show influence pathways. Co-sponsorship or affiliation graphs highlight coordination. Public data sources enable passive intelligence gathering. Federal Election Commission, FEC, filings, open secrets or equivalent donor databases, IRS Form 990s for non-profits, university alumni directories, corporate board listings, via SEC filings or services like BoardX, property records, court documents, and social media graphs. Advanced OSINT aggregates these into visual maps using tools for graph databases, revealing clusters around specific universities, clubs, e.g., certain country clubs, policy salons, or invitation-only gatherings, or industries. 3. Elite network analysis focuses on non-elected nodes because elected officials often function as visible outputs of deeper structures. A governor or senator may rotate, but the permanent bureaucracy, regulatory staff, aligned foundations, and media ecosystems persist. Identifying these nodes involves layering data, educational backgrounds, percentage of key actors from specific institutions, board interlocks, one individual serving on multiple influential boards creating transitive influence, and event co-attendance, fundraisers, galas, think tank conferences. Vulnerability assessment then locates fault lines, financial over-reliance on specific donors, whose contributions could face scrutiny or redirection. Moral, public commitments clashing with private actions or funding sources, and operational, decision-making bottlenecks in slow bureaucracies. 4. Signals and surveillance complements mapping with defensive and passive collection postures. Technical surveillance countermeasures, TSCM, professional bug sweeps using spectrum analyzers, nonlinear junction detectors, thermal imaging, and time domain reflectometers, protect campaign headquarters, sensitive meeting spaces, and the primary candidates' environments from electronic eavesdropping. Legacy networks or aligned actors may deploy sophisticated surveillance, assuming otherwise is operational negligence. Passive intelligence gathering emphasizes open-source intelligence, OSINT from public data silos, government records, news archives, social media, without active engagement that leaves footprints, corporate disclosures, and commercial data aggregators. Pattern of life poll analysis tracks opposition inner circle routines, travel, meetings, communication patterns, family and social associations, to identify predictable behaviors, vulnerabilities, or windows for friction without crossing into illegal active surveillance. Defensive SIGINT involves spoofing or minimizing the candidate's digital signature. Disciplined use of clean devices, VPNs or proxies for non-sensitive work, avoidance of unnecessary geolocation, and compartmentalized online presence. In an era of commercial data brokers selling location histories, purchase patterns, and social graphs, even private browsing leaves traces. The B team handles these functions in isolation, feeding sanitized insights to the A team via the cutout as public research findings or strategic environmental scans. The purpose of Phase II is preparation for asymmetry. Frontal assaults on well-resourced legacy networks rarely succeed. They invite overwhelming counter-mobilization through media, regulatory harassment, or donor retaliation. Mapping allows targeted disruption in Phase III, weaponizing ethics filings against overburdened staff, generating swarms of administrative obstacles, or timing narrative interventions to exploit known fault lines. It also informs contingency planning in Phase IV by highlighting which assets are most exposed. Historical and contemporary examples illustrate the power of grid mapping. Social network analysis of elite interactions has revealed how small cores of highly connected actors exert outsized influence, consistent with observations that elites form dense subnetworks while peripheries remain fragmented. In U.S. politics, donor networks mapped through campaign finance data show how contributions cluster and predict outcomes. Opposition research, long a staple, traditionally digs into personal histories, but gains strategic depth when integrated with institutional mapping. Not just what did the opponent do, but who sustains their ecosystem and where are its pressure points. Passive OSINT proves particularly potent because it leaves no detectable footprint, aligning perfectly with the firewall protocol. Tools and techniques include scraping public filings, analyzing LinkedIn or alumni networks for interlocks, reviewing event photos or attendee lists for co-presence, and cross-referencing with financial disclosures. Pattern of life extends this to temporal and spatial dimensions. Frequent meetings at specific venues may indicate informal decision nodes. Recurring associations with certain donors reveal dependencies. Challenges abound and must be addressed with discipline. Data overload requires prioritization, focus on load-bearing elements rather than exhaustive catalogs. Privacy laws and ethical boundaries limit active measures. The dual-track model confines aggressive collection to legal passive methods or B-team OSINT. False positives in network analysis, spurious connections, demand rigorous validation through multiple sources. Most critically, mapping must remain firewalled. A-team receives high-level insights framed as conventional opposition research or environmental scanning, preserving their idealistic posture. The mastermind maintains detachment here as well, directing resources toward nodes with highest leverage rather than personal grudges or shiny distractions. Psychological compartmentalization ensures analysts avoid mission creep into illegal territory, while idealists remain untainted by the mechanistic view of power. Phase II builds directly on Phase I without deniability infrastructure. Mapping invites counterintelligence, opposition researchers or law enforcement tracing digital queries, financial anomalies, or unusual inquiries. With it, the campaign achieves situational awareness superior to symmetric players reliant on public polling and surface-level media. This awareness enables disproportionate impact, imposing costs through bureaucracy the legacy network helped build, or highlighting hypocrisies that erode public legitimacy. Implementation requires dedicated B-team talent, analysts skilled in SNA software, e.g. graph visualization tools, OSINT specialists familiar with public records databases, and TSCM professionals for periodic sweeps. Budgeting routes through ghosted channels to maintain separation. Training emphasizes pattern recognition over sensationalism. A single donor's funding of multiple aligned nonprofits may matter more than one scandal. Ultimately, mapping the institutional grid demystifies power. Legacy networks appear monolithic from afar but reveal exploitable fractures upon close inspection, overloaded staff, conflicting incentives, reputational vulnerabilities, or coordination frictions. The dual-track architect exploits these without compromising the candidate's class-strata heroism. The public face fights on ideals and policy. The realist track prepares the terrain. This phase is diagnostic and preparatory. Accurate mapping informs every subsequent action, which ethics processes to trigger for maximum friction, which narratives will resonate because they strike known fault lines, which contingencies to pre-stage. Neglect it, and disruption becomes random and ineffective. Execute it with precision under the firewall protocol, and the campaign transforms from participant in the legacy game to architect of its disruption. The sections that follow provide detailed protocols for elite network analysis, institutional interconnectivity mapping, donor identification, vulnerability assessment, TSCM implementation, passive OSINT, pattern of life analysis, and defensive digital hygiene. Examples draw from observable public practices in political campaigns, opposition research, and network studies, adapted to the asymmetric context. Treat these as operational doctrine, actionable, compartmentalized, and subordinate to the mastermind's detached oversight. 3. Elite network analysis. Elite network analysis forms the core intelligence function of Phase II. It moves beyond individual opposition research, digging into a candidate's voting record, personal finances, or gaffes, to systemic understanding of the supporting grid. 3.1. Identifying the non-elected power nodes. Non-elected nodes constitute the durable backbone. Begin with systematic inventory using public sources. Categories include bureaucratic nodes, senior civil servants in regulatory agencies, state departments of education or environment, public health officials. These actors often outlast elected leadership and interpret or delay implementation of policies. Philanthropic and non-profit nodes. Executives at major foundations, 501(c)(3) and 501(c)(4) organizations that fund advocacy, research, and get-out-the-vote efforts. Their grant-making shapes agendas with less scrutiny than direct campaign contributions. Academic and credentialing nodes. University presidents, deans, influential professors, and administrators controlling curricula, admissions, and research priorities. Alumni networks extend influence into government and business. Media and narrative nodes. Editors, producers, columnists, and digital strategists at legacy outlets or aligned platforms. Their gatekeeping and framing amplify or suppress stories. Corporate and advisory nodes. Compliance officers, ESG leads, think tank fellows, and lobbyists who translate policy into operational constraints or opportunities for aligned interests. Identification methods rely on passive OSINT. Compile lists from organizational charts, where public, LinkedIn profiles, searching titles and connections, board memberships listed in annual reports or IRS filings, and news mentions of appointments or speeches. Cross-reference with donor databases to see funding flows. Example, mapping a state's education policy grid might reveal a cluster of former university administrators now in state education department roles, connected through a specific reform foundation and funded by overlapping donors. Centrality metrics, degree, betweenness, highlight brokers who connect disparate parts of the network. In practice, B-team analysts build layered databases, one for individuals, one for organizations, and relationship edges, shared board, co-authorship, event co-attendance, funding. Visualization tools help spot dense clusters, for instance, a policy salon where key regulators, foundation officers, and academics meet regularly. 3.2 Mapping institutional interconnectivity, schools, boards, and social clubs. Interconnectivity creates resilience through redundancy and informal coordination. Educational pipelines are primary, track percentages of key actors sharing alma maters. Certain universities or graduate programs function as elite filters and networking hubs. Board interlocks multiply influence. One person on the boards of a foundation, a university, and a non-profit creates transitive alignment. Social clubs and informal venues add the human layer. Country clubs, policy dinners, invitation-only retreats, or alumni events facilitate trust building outside formal structures. Mapping requires collecting attendee lists from public event coverage, photos with metadata, or indirect references in biographies. Example, analysis of a major city's power structure might show heavy overlap between members of a prestigious downtown club, university trustees, and major regional foundation boards. These connections explain rapid mobilization against challengers, coordinated op-eds, donor signals to aligned PACs, or bureaucratic slowdowns. Use graph theory concepts without overcomplicating. Identify cliques, fully connected subgroups, and structural holes, gaps where a broker gains power by bridging. Public tools and commercial databases accelerate this. Validate through multiple sources to avoid errors from outdated data. 3.3 Identifying the load-bearing donors of the opposition. Load-bearing donors sustain the grid across cycles. They are not merely wealthy contributors but those whose funds enable infrastructure. Sustained staffing at nonprofits, polling operations, legal defense funds, or media projects. Identification draws from FEC data, state campaign finance disclosures, IRS 990 forms, showing grants, and donor-advised fund patterns where visible. Prioritize donors appearing in multiple entities supporting the opposition ecosystem. Analyze concentration. Does a handful of foundations or individuals fund 60-70% of key advocacy groups? Track evolution over cycles. Shifts in giving may signal strategic adjustments. Example, in education policy contests, certain national philanthropies consistently fund local reform organizations, teacher-aligned groups or countergroups, and research institutes. Mapping their grantees reveals the parallel infrastructure that outlasts any single candidate. B-Team produces sanitized summaries for A-Team. Key funding clusters support X policy priorities through Y organizations, framed as standard opposition intelligence rather than deep network penetration. 3.4 Vulnerability assessment, locating the moral and financial fault lines. Vulnerability assessment translates mapping into actionable intelligence. Financial fault lines include over-reliance on controversial donors, creating hypocrisy narratives, funding cliffs if major sources face scrutiny, or inefficient allocation exposed by internal metrics. Moral fault lines arise from gaps between public rhetoric, equity, transparency, democracy, and private realities, elite school preferences, donor influence, revolving doors. Methods: cross-reference public statements with actions using news archives and filings. Pattern analysis reveals inconsistencies, e.g., an official championing campaign finance reform while benefiting from dark money pipelines. Institutional vulnerabilities include bureaucratic bottlenecks, specific offices with high workloads and slow processes, or coordination frictions between factions within the grid. Prioritize high leverage, low-risk targets. A donor whose contributions could be highlighted for conflict without illegal targeting, or a regulatory process known for delays that can be amplified through legal, compliant filings. Assessment outputs feed directly into phase III tactics while remaining compartmentalized. 4. Signals and surveillance. This section establishes defensive and passive collection postures to protect the campaign while gathering environmental intelligence. 4. 1. Technical surveillance countermeasures, TSCM, for campaign HQs. TSCM protects against electronic eavesdropping, hidden microphones, cameras, wiretaps, or implants. Professional services use specialized equipment, spectrum analyzers detecting transmissions, nonlinear junction detectors finding semiconductors in walls or furniture, thermal cameras identifying heat signatures from active devices, and physical inspections of outlets, fixtures, and HVAC. Protocol: conduct baseline sweeps upon securing any headquarters or sensitive meeting location, followed by periodic resweeps, quarterly or before major strategy sessions. Extend to the primary candidate's residence or travel accommodations when feasible. Live monitoring options exist for high-threat periods. Engage accredited TSCM firms experienced with corporate or political clients. Route contracts through ghosted entities per phase. Example: a campaign HQ in a contested urban area undergoes a full sweep revealing no devices, but identifying vulnerabilities in Wi-Fi configuration and shared building infrastructure. Mitigation includes Faraday enclosures for sensitive discussions or dedicated clean rooms. Findings remain strictly B-team. A-team receives only general, security protocols enhanced guidance. 4.2 Passive intelligence gathering, monitoring public data silos. Passive gathering relies exclusively on open sources to avoid footprints, key silos. Government records, FEC, IRS, state ethics commissions, court dockets, property and business filings. Corporate disclosures, SEC filings, board listings. Media and academic archives, news databases, scholarly publications, event reports. Social and professional networks, public profiles, group memberships analyzed without interaction. B-team analysts aggregate using structured queries, building timelines and relationship maps. Tools range from free search engines to specialized OSINT platforms. Focus on verifiable multi-source data. Example: monitoring a key opposition donor involves reviewing contribution histories, grant lists from recipient 990s, and co-appearances at events. Patterns emerge: consistent support for specific narrative-shaping organizations, without any direct contact. This approach aligns with deniability. All data is publicly available. Analysis occurs in firewalled compartments. 4.3 Pattern of life analysis, tracking the oppositions in a circle. Pattern of life poll examines routines, associations, and behaviors over time to identify predictability or stress points. Sources remain passive: public travel records, where available, event attendance, social media timestamps, without engagement, news mentions of appearances, and vehicle or property data if public. Construct timelines, daily, weekly routines, office arrivals, recurring meetings, travel patterns, key relationships, frequent co-attendees. Identify anomalies or leverage. Heavy reliance on specific venues for informal coordination, family schedules creating predictable absences, or recurring participation in vulnerable public forums. Example: poll on an inner circle operative might reveal frequent early morning coffees at a particular location with regulators, suggesting an informal node. This informs timing for narrative interventions or administrative actions rather than direct targeting. Analysis stays B-team, outputs are abstracted, observed coordination patterns suggest. For higher-level use, legal and ethical guardrails are mandatory. No private surveillance, no hacking, no trespass. Focus on public or commercially available data. 4.4 Defensive SIGINT, spoofing the candidate's digital signature. Defensive signals intelligence minimizes the campaign's own exposure. Protocols include device hygiene, dedicated clean devices for sensitive work, regular factory resets or wipes, avoidance of personal accounts on campaign hardware. Network practices, VPNs or proxies, segmented Wi-Fi, avoidance of public networks for operational matters. Behavioral discipline, minimize geolocation sharing, use pseudonymous or compartmentalized accounts where necessary, limit unnecessary online activity. Metadata awareness, train staff on how emails, calendars, and apps leak patterns. B-Team conducts periodic audits of digital footprint using OSINT techniques against the campaign itself. Spoofing elements might involve strategic noise, low-sensitivity activity to mask patterns, or routing through intermediaries. Example: the primary candidate maintains a public-facing social presence managed by A-Team with strict guidelines. High-level strategy discussions avoid digital entirely, relying on analog per phase I defensive measures, ensure opposition OSINT yields little actionable insight beyond public messaging. Phase II culminates in integrated intelligence products, network maps, vulnerability matrices, defensive posture reports, and sanitized briefs. These enable precise execution in Phase III while preserving the firewall. The institutional grid, once mapped, loses some of its mystique and gains exploitable texture. Discipline in collection, analysis, and compartmentalization determines whether this phase yields strategic advantage or wasted effort. Rigorous adherence to passive methods, TSCM best practices, and need-to-know principles ensures the dual-track model functions as intended. Idealists advance the public vision unburdened by mechanistic details. Realists prepare the operational terrain with cold precision. The mastermind synthesizes at the apex, directing resources where leverage is highest. This mapping is never complete. Networks evolve with new appointments, funding shifts, or external events. Treat it as iterative, with periodic refreshes feeding continuous adaptation. Accurate intelligence protected by Phase I infrastructure positions the campaign to impose asymmetric costs, erode legitimacy through targeted exposure of fault lines, and create openings for structural disruption. Preamble to Phase III, active sabotage and disruption. Phase III represents the transition from intelligence preparation to calibrated action. With the infrastructure of deniability, Phase I providing structural segregation, cutouts, analog communications, financial ghosting, and personnel compartmentalization, and with the institutional grid mapped in Phase II through elite network analysis, interconnectivity mapping, load-bearing donor identification, vulnerability assessment, TSCM protection, passive OSINT, pattern of life tracking, and defensive SIGINT. The dual-track architect now possesses the protected operational space and situational awareness required for active sabotage and disruption. This phase operationalizes asymmetry. Legacy networks derive power from institutional inertia, resource depth, narrative control, regulatory capture, and coordinated friction against challengers. A symmetric campaign, heavy on public rallies, policy papers, and conventional advertising, collides directly with these advantages and is typically neutralized through media amplification, donor retaliation, bureaucratic delays, or selective enforcement. Asymmetric disruption instead imposes disproportionate costs on the opponent while minimizing exposure to the primary candidate and A-team. It exploits the grid's own rules, fault lines, and predictable responses. The dual-track model remains paramount. The A-team continues projecting optical purity and class-straighter heroism, the authentic outsider challenging elite consensus on behalf of broader public interests. Any visible linkage to disruption tactics would collapse moral authority, invite accusations of hypocrisy, and transform the candidate from reformer into just another insider playing the same game. The B-team, insulated through firewalls and cutouts, executes or enables the mechanics of friction, data influence, infiltration, and narrative positioning. The mastermind maintains detachment, directing efforts toward high leverage, deniable outcomes rather than personal vendettas or overreach that risks blowback. 5. Institutional friction tactics weaponize the bureaucracy and administrative processes that legacy networks helped construct. Triggering ethics filings, audits, and compliance reviews consumes opponent resources, staff time, legal fees, diverted attention, without requiring direct confrontation. The swarm method generates seemingly spontaneous, independent administrative obstacles, multiple FOIA requests, citizen complaints, regulatory inquiries, or ethics filings from varied actors that overwhelm capacity. These create cumulative paper cuts rather than a single decisive blow, exploiting slow bureaucratic response times and risk-averse cultures. Data poisoning corrupts internal decision metrics, such as polling or analytics, inducing misallocation of opponent resources toward low-yield targets or false confidence. Social engineering at low levels, building relationships with operational staff without high-level compromise, yields insights into workflows, internal tensions, or vulnerabilities while preserving deniability. These tactics draw from observed patterns in political contests where legal and administrative processes are leveraged offensively. Lawfare, ethics complaints, inspector general referrals, or audits can tie up senior personnel for months, forcing defensive postures that slow campaign momentum. Swarms amplify this by distributing effort across proxies or aligned complainants, making central direction difficult to prove. Success depends on precision from phase II mapping, target known bottlenecks, overloaded offices, or processes with high compliance costs. All actions must remain legal on their face, exercising public rights to file complaints or request records, while achieving operational effect through volume and timing. 6. Narrative delegitimization operates in the information domain. The controlled leak cycle disperses damaging or embarrassing information through indirect channels calibrated for dispersion while maintaining distance, trusted intermediaries, aligned outlets, or platforms where attribution is diffuse. Direct-to-voter pipelines, email lists, alternative platforms, grassroots networks, and unmediated digital channels bypass legacy gatekeepers whose credibility has eroded. Weaponizing silence turns predictable media bias or selective coverage into the story itself. When legacy outlets ignore substantive issues or overemphasize peripheral ones, their omissions or framing become self-indicting evidence of institutional alignment. Optical purity for the candidate is maintained by positioning attacks as establishment panic against a genuine disruptor who refuses to play by insider rules. Narrative efforts exploit asymmetries in open information environments. Legacy media often operates under commercial and ideological incentives that favor certain framings. Decentralized dissemination can highlight these incentives without fabricating content. The class strata, hero status serves dual purposes. It inoculates the candidate against charges of elitism and frames opposition tactics as defense of the status quo. Controlled leaks must be factual or plausibly sourced to avoid easy dismissal as disinformation, with timing coordinated via cutouts to maximize impact relative to opponent vulnerabilities identified in phase II. Phase III is inherently risky. Over-execution invites mirrored responses, legal scrutiny, or public backlash that erodes the very legitimacy the campaign seeks to build. Under-execution leaves the legacy grid intact and able to reassert dominance. Discipline requires constant calibration. Actions must impose measurable costs or erode narratives without crossing into clearly illegal territory that could compromise the firewall or candidate. The B team analyzes second and third order effects, potential counter-swarming, media amplification of dirty tricks accusations, or internal team morale impacts, feeding sanitized insights upward. Historical and contemporary analogues illustrate both potential and pitfalls. Lawfare-style tactics, including ethics complaints and audits, have been employed across political spectrums to impose delays and costs, as seen in various high-profile cases involving government officials facing bar complaints, inspector general reviews, or congressional inquiries. Swarming via coordinated but deniable administrative actions echoes paper-cut strategies in protracted conflicts, where cumulative friction exhausts resources. Data influence operations including attempts to shape internal metrics or public perception through information flooding, parallel observed influence campaigns that seed narratives or distort analytics. Narrative delegitimization through leaks has featured in numerous cycles, from email releases to selective disclosures, often amplified when media selectivity becomes the counter-narrative. In asymmetric contexts, these methods succeed when subordinated to larger strategy, creating windows for positive vision, institution building, or electoral breakthrough rather than perpetual sabotage. Pure disruption without parallel construction risks mutual degradation of norms, where all sides adopt mirror tactics and public trust in institutions collapses further. The dual-track model mitigates this by confining realist mechanics to the B team, while the A team articulates renewal and accountability. Implementation demands B team talent in legal analysis, OSINT monitoring of responses, and operational security. Routing occurs through ghosted channels. Training emphasizes restraint. Every action is evaluated against deniability thresholds, optical risk to the candidate, and alignment with mapped vulnerabilities. The mastermind reviews high-impact proposals through the cutout, ensuring detachment from tactical excitement. Phase III builds directly on prior phases. Without phase I firewalls, active measures produce rapid contamination and exposure. Without phase II mapping, efforts become scattershot and ineffective. Outputs from this phase inform phase IV contingencies, prefabricated disavowals for compromised assets, evidence sanitization protocols, and post-election dissolution or reintegration plans. Ultimately, active sabotage and disruption serve a functional purpose in the legacy network contest. They level the playing field by exploiting inertia and hypocrisies, erode unearned legitimacy, and create space for genuine alternatives. Executed with precision under compartmentalization, they embody Sun Tzu's indirect approach, winning through shaping the environment rather than symmetric collision. Neglected, they leave challengers vulnerable to the grid's superior coordination. The sections that follow detail protocols, calibration criteria, deniability measures, and illustrative examples drawn from observable public practices in political and institutional contests. Treat them as doctrine, actionable within legal bounds, subordinated to the mastermind's oversight, and always secondary to delivering tangible breaks from legacy dysfunction. 5. Institutional friction tactics. Institutional friction exploits the slow, rule-bound nature of bureaucracies, regulatory bodies, ethics offices, and administrative processes. Legacy networks often staff or influence these layers, making them both shield and vulnerability. The goal is not outright destruction, but sustained imposition of costs, time, money, attention, and decision paralysis. 5.1 Triggering bureaucratic inertia, weaponizing ethics filings and audits. Ethics filings and audits are powerful because they trigger mandatory reviews, document production, and defensive legal postures. Public actors and aligned groups can file complaints with state bars, ethics commissions, inspector general offices, or regulatory bodies citing apparent conflicts, disclosure failures, or procedural irregularities. Even meritless or marginally grounded filings require responses, diverting senior staff from core campaign or governance functions. Protocol: B team uses phase II mapping to identify high-value targets, officials with known financial dependencies, board interlocks suggesting conflicts, or histories of selective enforcement. Complaints are drafted with precise, verifiable citations from public records, FEC filings, 990 forms, property records, speeches vs. actions. Multiple filings from different complainants, individual citizens, watchdog groups, or unrelated entities create volume without obvious coordination. Timing aligns with critical campaign periods, pre-debate, fundraising windows, or policy rollouts to maximize distraction. Example: in contested races, opposition researchers have filed ethics complaints over donor ties or revolving door issues, forcing months of responses and public statements. A mapped load-bearing donor with overlapping non-profit and government-adjacent roles might trigger conflict of interest inquiries. Sanitized summaries reach A-team as notable public scrutiny developing around opponent practices, preserving optical distance. Risks include dismissal as frivolous, mitigated by factual grounding, or counter-filings, anticipated via contingencies. All actions remain within legal rights to petition government, no fabrication of evidence, Documentation of public source basis supports deniability. 5.2 The swarm method, generating spontaneous administrative obstacles. The swarm creates the appearance of organic, widespread public or stakeholder pressure through distributed low-level actions. This overwhelms administrative capacity without a single traceable command center. Components, coordinated but deniable waves of FOIA or public records, requests targeting specific offices or decisions, citizen complaints to regulatory agencies on permitting, compliance, or zoning tied to opponent-aligned entities, ethics or campaign finance inquiries from varied individuals or small groups, public comment submissions on pending rules or appointments. B-Team identifies triggers from pattern of life and network maps, e.g., a key inner circle operative chairing a board with upcoming decisions, or a donor-funded initiative facing renewal. Proxies or cutout facilitated networks, framed as independent civic engagement, submit requests on staggered schedules with varied language to reduce pattern detection. Digital tools enable scaling, while analog protocols handle sensitive coordination. Example, during policy debates, swarms of records requests on related grants or contracts have delayed implementation by forcing document review and legal consultation. In one observed case, multiple unrelated parties filing on the same donor-funded non-profit created backlogs. Outputs appear as grassroots activism. A team can reference growing public concern without knowledge of orchestration. Calibration prevents oversaturation that invites investigation into coordination. 5.3 Data poisoning, corrupting the opposition's internal polling metrics. Data poisoning influences decision-making by feeding flawed inputs into analytical processes. In campaigns, this might involve shaping public or leaked data environments that opponents incorporate into internal models, or indirect influence on commercial polling through seeded narratives or response patterns. Approaches remain passive or indirect to maintain legality and deniability, amplifying certain public signals, event turnout, social sentiment proxies that skew sampling assumptions, encouraging public discourse that alters respondent behavior in future polls, or, in advanced scenarios, influencing data ecosystems that feed analytics, though strictly legal OSINT and narrative means. B-Team monitors opponent polling public releases or leaks and identifies reliance on specific methodologies or sources. Example, historical cases show campaigns reacting to manipulated or contested public polls, reallocating resources based on perceived leads or weaknesses, seeding narratives around shifting voter sentiment in targeted demographics can induce over or underconfidence if opponents weight those signals. Modern variants include shaping online environments that AI-assisted analytics might ingest, though the manual restricts to legal narrative and OSINT amplification. Strict compartmentalization ensures A-Team receives only observed polling volatility insights. Risks include detection or backfire. Mitigation relies on subtlety and multi-source validation from phase II. 5.4 Social engineering, infiltrating low-level operational staff. Social engineering builds human sources at operational levels without targeting principles. Low-level staff, schedulers, data entry, event coordinators, junior researchers, often possess granular workflow knowledge, internal frustrations, or access to non-public but non-sensitive information. Methods: B-Team operatives or cutout facilitated contacts establish relationships through neutral pretexts, shared professional events, civic groups or online communities. Cultivation emphasizes listening, empathy and gradual trust building rather than direct elicitation. Insights focus on process bottlenecks, morale issues, or predictable routines that inform friction timing. Example, knowledge of overloaded compliance teams or recurring meeting cadences allows precise swarm timing. A junior staffer expressing frustration over donor influence might indirectly confirm mapped vulnerabilities. No illegal inducements or hacking, relationships framed as ordinary networking. Information is abstracted and sanitized before transmission via cutout. This completes institutional friction. Combined, these tactics impose cumulative costs, force defensive postures, and create exploitable delays while preserving deniability through legal channels and distributed execution. 6. Narrative delegitimization. Narrative efforts shape perception of the contest itself, eroding the opponent's moral or institutional standing. 6.1 The controlled leak cycle, information dispersion strategy. Controlled leaks release or amplify verifiable information through layers that obscure origin. Cycles involve seeding to secondary outlets or platforms, monitoring uptake, then indirect reinforcement. Protocol, B-team packages public record-derived material, donor inconsistencies, board interlocks versus public statements, or legitimately obtained insights. Dispersion uses cutouts or aligned but independent actors. Timing leverages opponent vulnerabilities or news cycles. Deniability layers include multiple hops and varied framing. Example, leaks of email troves or documents have shifted narratives when amplified, though success varies with public receptivity and media handling. Factual grounding reduces dismissal risk. A team references emerging reports without coordination. 6.2 Bypassing gatekeepers, direct-to-voter information pipelines. Direct pipelines reduce reliance on legacy media. Owned email SMS lists, alternative platforms, grassroots networks, candidate appearances, and unfiltered digital content. Content emphasizes contrasts drawn from mapped grid realities, elite interconnections versus public interest rhetoric. Maintenance involves disciplined data hygiene per phase I and consistent messaging, aligned with optical purity. 6.3 Weaponizing silence, making the media's bias the lead story. When legacy outlets under or overcover issues, highlight the selectivity itself. Track coverage disparities using public metrics, airtime, headline analysis, and amplify through direct channels or proxies. Frame as evidence of institutional alignment rather than isolated bias. Example, selective focus on certain scandals while ignoring others has been countered by meta-narratives questioning gatekeeping. This turns opponent strength, media relationships, into a liability when overplayed. 6.4 Optical purity, maintaining the candidate's class strata hero status. The candidate embodies rejection of elite consensus in service of broader renewal. Messaging consistently contrasts personal or policy independence with mapped grid dependencies of opponents. Any disruption is framed externally as necessary accountability, never linked operationally. A team training reinforces authenticity. B-team actions never surface in candidate communications. Phase III execution requires relentless calibration, legal review routed through ghosted channels, and iterative feedback from mapping and defensive surveillance. Success metrics include measurable opponent resource diversion, narrative shifts in direct pipelines, and preserved optical purity. Failures trigger phase IV burn protocols. When integrated, institutional friction and narrative delegitimization create compounding effects. Bureaucratic paralysis amplifies narrative contrasts, while eroded legitimacy reduces opponent resilience to friction. The dual-track model ensures these mechanics support rather than define the public campaign. This phase demands the highest discipline. Asymmetric advantage accrues to those who disrupt without self-destruction, impose costs proportionally, and maintain the moral high ground in public view. Legacy networks are resilient. Only sustained, firewalled execution under mastermind detachment creates durable openings for renewal. Preamble to Phase IV, Contingency and Collapse. Phase IV, Contingency and Collapse, serves as the critical safeguard and exit architecture for the entire dual-track architect model. While Phases I through III focus on building deniability infrastructure, mapping the institutional grid, and executing active sabotage and disruption, no operational blueprint is complete without robust mechanisms for failure, compromise, or mission evolution. In asymmetric political warfare, the legacy network possesses superior resources, institutional memory, and adaptive capacity. Even meticulously planned campaigns encounter unforeseen variables. Leaks despite analog protocols, pattern recognition by opposition researchers or regulators, internal human failure, electoral defeat, or shifting external conditions that render continued operations counterproductive. The burn switch represents the disciplined recognition that every asset, tactic, and structure has a life cycle. Continuing compromised elements risks cascading contamination that destroys not only the current effort but the long-term viability of the broader movement. The dual-track model, with its absolute segregation of the A-team, idealists maintaining optical purity and class strata heroism, from the B-team, realists executing technical and disruptive functions, depends on ironclad compartmentation. Phase IV ensures that if this firewall is breached or the operational environment collapses, the public-facing elements remain insulated. The primary candidate's moral authority is preserved, and future optionality is protected. Contingency planning in this phase is proactive, not reactive. It begins during the earliest stages of campaign architecture, with prefabricated protocols, trigger thresholds, and decision trees embedded in the mastermind's oversight. Identifying compromised assets requires continuous monitoring layered atop phase II pattern of life analysis and defensive SIGINT. The rogue element, defense prepositions disavowal narratives that frame any exposure as the actions of isolated individuals operating outside authorized channels. Evidence sanitization addresses both physical and digital trails, acknowledging that complete erasure is impossible in the modern era, but substantial reduction of linkage is achievable through disciplined tradecraft. Post-election transition planning addresses the unique challenges of victory or defeat, reintegrating usable talent without violating compartmentation or executing permanent dissolution to eliminate lingering vulnerabilities. The master's detachment reaches its highest expression in phase IV. Emotional investment in specific assets, sunk cost fallacies, or the thrill of operational mechanics can cloud judgment precisely when clarity is most needed. The mastermind must treat the entire enterprise as architecture, modular, replaceable, and subordinate to the strategic objective of legacy network disruption rather than personal or tribal vendettas. This detachment enables ruthless evaluation. When does continued operation impose greater risk than benefit? When does partial exposure require controlled burn rather than salvage? History of intelligence operations, revolutionary movements, and high-stakes political campaigns demonstrates that failure to implement timely burn protocols often produces greater long-term damage than the initial compromise itself. 7.1 Identifying compromised assets establishes early warning systems. Compromise can manifest through digital footprints despite analog preferences, human error, indiscretion, financial pressure, ideological drift, opposition counterintelligence, or internal suspicion that begins eroding the firewall. Indicators include anomalous surveillance patterns, unexpected inquiries from regulators or media, behavioral changes in personnel, or inconsistencies in sanitized reporting through the cutout. B-team analysts, insulated from A-team visibility, maintain dedicated monitoring cells that cross-reference phase II network maps with real-time defensive intelligence. 7.2 The rogue element defense prefabricates plausible documented narratives that isolate any exposure. By establishing clear chains of command on paper, while actual operations remain firewalled, the campaign can attribute deviations to overzealous or unauthorized actors. This defense is not post hoc rationalization, but a pre-planned doctrinal element, drilled and documented in sanitized form. 7.3 Evidence sanitization addresses the persistent nature of modern records. Physical dead drops, paper notes, and analog materials require secure destruction protocols. Digital remnants, metadata, cloud backups, device logs, financial trails through tertiary shells demand layered deletion, overwriting, and obfuscation. Complete sanitization is aspirational. The goal is raising the forensic threshold beyond casual or mid-level investigation while maintaining compliance where legally required. 7.4 Post-election transition recognizes that campaigns are temporary structures. Victory demands careful reintegration of B-team capabilities into governance without contaminating the new administration's legitimacy. Defeat requires orderly dissolution to prevent loose ends that could haunt future cycles. Both scenarios test the psychological compartmentalization of all involved. The author's note on implementation underscores the foundational paradox. Efficacy depends on the mastermind's detachment and the absolute ignorance of the A-team regarding B-team realities. Once suspicion arises, the moral authority cultivated through optical purity evaporates. The right hand and left hand must function as if belonging to separate bodies, coordinated only at the apex. This managed duality is psychologically taxing and logistically demanding, yet essential in environments where legacy networks weaponize transparency rules, media amplification, and selective enforcement against challengers. Phase IV is not pessimistic but realist. It acknowledges that asymmetric efforts often face superior opposition and that politics operates in cycles rather than single decisive battles. Successful historical challengers, whether in institutional reform, political realignments, or influence operations, maintained viability precisely because they planned for reversal, exposure, or transition. They burned compromised elements cleanly, preserved core narratives, and rebuilt with lessons internalized. Neglect of contingency converts temporary setbacks into permanent defeats. Implementation requires embedding Phase IV considerations from day one. Trigger thresholds, e.g., specific indicators of compromise, are defined during personnel vetting. In Phase I, disavowal templates are drafted and stress-tested. Sanitization drills occur periodically under the guise of standard operational security training. Transition scenarios are wargamed through the cutout. Resource allocation includes dedicated contingency reserves routed through ghosted channels. Risks in this phase include premature activation, destroying viable assets through paranoia, or delayed activation, allowing contamination to spread. The mastermind mitigates through detached, evidence-based decision-making supported by B-team analysis. Psychological support for key personnel, framed neutrally, helps manage the stress of potential dissolution. In the broader dual-track framework, Phase IV closes the operational loop. It protects the idealistic core that sustains public mobilization while enabling the realist track to operate with calculated aggression. By planning for collapse, the campaign gains resilience. The knowledge that burn switches exist encourages bolder calibrated action in phases II and III, secure in the understanding that failure modes have been anticipated. This phase demands the highest level of tradecraft discipline. Sanitization protocols must be executable under pressure. Narratives must be consistent with prior public positioning. Transitions must preserve institutional knowledge without violating compartmentation. When executed with precision, Phase IV transforms potential catastrophe into managed evolution, ensuring the movement's survival beyond any single contest. The sections that follow detail the burn switch protocols with operational specificity, decision criteria, examples drawn from observable political and institutional precedents, risk matrices, and implementation checklists. These are presented as doctrine for the realist track, always transmitted through authorized channels and subordinated to the mastermind's detached judgment. Study them thoroughly. In asymmetric political warfare, the difference between transient disruption and enduring legacy network erosion often lies in the quality of contingency architecture. 7. The burn switch. The burn switch is the doctrinal mechanism for controlled degradation or termination of compromised elements while preserving the core mission and public brand. It is activated only upon clear indicators, never reactively or emotionally. Activation authority rests exclusively with the mastermind, with the liaison officer serving as the transmission channel. 7.1 Identifying compromised assets. Compromised assets include personnel, communication channels, financial structures, or operational activities showing credible indicators of exposure or failure. Identification relies on layered monitoring established in Phase II. Key indicators: anomalous external interest, unexpected subpoenas, media inquiries targeting specific non-public details, or surveillance patterns inconsistent with baseline TSCM sweeps. Human factors, behavioral changes, anxiety, financial irregularities, ideological shifts, indiscreet communications detected via passive monitoring, failed loyalty checks during periodic revetting. Technical breaches, digital footprints appearing despite protocols, dead drop disturbances, or inconsistencies in reporting through the cutout. Pattern recognition, opposition network maps showing new focus on campaign-related nodes or donors. B-Team maintains a dedicated integrity cell that aggregates indicators into risk scores. Thresholds are predefined: low enhanced monitoring, medium isolation and testing, high activation of burn protocols. Examples include a cutout showing signs of external pressure, sudden lifestyle changes, or a tertiary shell entity receiving unusual regulatory scrutiny. Upon identification, the mastermind receives sanitized assessment. Options range from enhanced compartmentalization to full isolation. Documentation of the decision process remains minimal and analog where possible. This step prevents cascade by isolating issues early, preserving the A-team's unawareness. 7.2 The rogue element defense, prefabricating disavowal narratives. Prefabrication creates ready-to-deploy narratives that attribute any exposure to unauthorized individual action. Core elements: clear, documented policy statements, sanitized, emphasizing adherence to legal and ethical standards. Chains of command that appear conventional on paper. Prepositioned public statements, internal memos, and third-party testimonials, framing the campaign as victim of overzealous actors. Protocol: develop multiple scenario templates during phase I, e.g., unauthorized data analysis, rogue contractor, disgruntled former associate. These are stress-tested for consistency with the candidate's class strata positioning. We reject dirty tactics and stand for transparency. The cutout maintains access to these templates in secure analog form. Example: in past political scandals, campaigns successfully distanced themselves by promptly condemning unauthorized actions by a single individual and cooperating with investigations on surface level. Prefabrication allows rapid response before opposition narratives solidify. Media and A-team channels receive coordinated talking points, emphasizing the candidate's commitment to higher standards, turning potential liability into reinforcement of optical purity. Activation includes isolation of the asset, severance of all contact, and controlled public positioning. Legal counsel routed through ghosted entities reviews language for defensibility. 7.3 Evidence sanitization, scrubbing the physical and digital paper trail. Sanitization raises the cost and complexity of forensic reconstruction. It is never perfect and must comply with legal hold requirements if formal investigations begin. Physical sanitization, scheduled destruction of analog materials, notes, dead drop logs, using crosscut shredding followed by incineration or professional services. Secure storage transitioning to destruction upon triggers. Cleaning of meeting locations and cover materials. Digital sanitization, overwriting storage media, factory resets, and use of secure deletion tools on clean devices. Migration and deletion of cloud data through tertiary accounts. Financial trail obfuscation, closing layered shells after legitimate invoicing, with records retained only as required. Metadata scrubbing on any residual files. Protocol includes scorched earth checklists executed in sequence with verification steps. B-team specialists trained in digital hygiene lead execution under mastermind approval. Example: upon compromise signal, a B-team safe house undergoes full physical sweep and destruction of documents, while associated devices are wiped and decommissioned. Tertiary entities are wound down with final compliant filings. Ongoing habituation through drills ensures execution under stress. Residual risk is acknowledged. Sophisticated adversaries may recover partial data, hence the importance of minimal initial creation of records. 7.4 Post-election transition, reintegrating teams or permanent dissolution. Transition planning addresses two primary outcomes: victory transition, selective reintegration of B-team capabilities into governance structures without violating compartmentation. Technical specialists may transition to advisory or administrative roles under new cover stories. Knowledge transfer occurs through abstracted lessons rather than operational details. The firewall partially evolves but never dissolves fully to protect against future cycles. A team assumes primary governance roles, maintaining heroic narrative. Defeat or collapse transition, orderly dissolution. Assets receive severance through compliant channels with non-disclosure agreements and final compartmentalization briefings. Materials are sanitized, networks are stood down, and cover stories are reinforced. Knowledge, lessons learned, network maps is preserved in abstracted, secure form for future mastermind use. Example: post-election, successful campaigns have absorbed analysts into policy roles while distancing from operational elements. Failed efforts that dissolved cleanly avoided lingering scandals. Protocols include exit interviews, sanitized, resource reallocation, and psychological wind-down support. Permanent dissolution of specific B-team cells may occur even in victory if contamination risk is high. The mastermind evaluates long-term movement benefit over short-term utility. This completes the burn switch. Phase IV ensures the dual-track architect survives contact with reality, preserving the capacity for future disruption even after temporary collapse. Author's note on implementation. The efficacy of this manual relies on the mastermind's detachment. The moment the A-team suspects the existence of the B-team, the moral authority of the movement collapses. Strategy is the art of ensuring the right hand never knows what the left hand is doing, even if they both belong to the same body. This detachment is not cynicism but supreme discipline. It demands a leader capable of orchestrating duality without contamination, evaluating assets coldly, and activating burn protocols without hesitation. Idealists provide the mobilizing vision and public legitimacy. Realists provide the leverage against resilient structures. Their separation is the force multiplier. Implementation across all phases requires talent selection, relentless drilling, resource discipline, and iterative refinement. Legacy networks were not built in a single cycle. Their disruption demands sustained, adaptive effort. Use this blueprint as functional doctrine. Adapt it to specific terrains. Maintain the firewall above all. The dual-track architect offers a path through asymmetric conditions. Execute with precision, detachment, and unwavering focus on the ultimate objective, meaningful disruption of the legacy network in service of renewed governance.